What a pleasure. Jan, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to that. We have a lot of promise here at Texas Children's Hospital to be able to make a difference on behalf of patients with diabetes and endocrine disorders. As you've heard, that's been the major passion of mine. So I wanted to briefly talk about why me. Why is a pediatric endocrinologist talking about nutrition and this topic of fat versus carbohydrates? As Jan mentioned, my professional life has been focused on type 1 diabetes, which is a big, big problem. 1.25 million Americans have type 1 diabetes, and injected insulin is the only available therapy. It's a serious problem. It's the most common life-threatening chronic illness of childhood, and there's major risk of life-threatening complications, even when treated pretty well. Potentially preventable with tight control, but it's incredibly hard to do. And we know that carbohydrate intake can play a big role to ultimately help people in diabetes control. And low carb can be very, very helpful. So I began to read and think about that through my conversations with adults who live with type 1 diabetes, including Kelly Sarasolo, who's a nurse practitioner in our center. And over the years, this awareness about the role of low carb in diabetes therapy has increased. And this is one really great example. This comes from a terrific website called Dietary. And this is a young man named Adam Brown who lives with type 1 diabetes. And he recently wrote a blog post describing his experience with low carb versus high carb. And he essentially describes the meal on the left, which is spinach and some nuts, versus the meal on the right, which is oats and bread. And his own experience in living with type 1, he carried out a sort of short experiment, if you will. And this graph shows you the glucose control that he was able to achieve on the low carb, high fat. There's some squiggles on that line, but not very many. And in comparison, when he went to high carb, he had many more squiggles. And what he said was that the squiggles really represent his roller coasting blood sugars, and they were terrifying for him. So for somebody with type 1 diabetes, this is potentially a really big deal. And so I've spent a bunch of time talking to adults who live with type 1, trying to ask the question, is this diet a potential way that we could offer for our patients who live with type 1? There have been terrific scientific reviews on the topic, including this one, that describe it in greater detail. But I just wanted to introduce this overall idea of low carb as an intervention for type 1 as part of my journey. How did I spend so much time learning and trying to understand this topic? So then I want to briefly go to the problem and talk about the size of the problem. So I'm going to switch slides here and go back. So we are living in an amazing time. And these are slides that come from the Centers for Disease Control. And they describe, I'm going to pull the microphone up. So these slides describe the trends in obesity in our nation over the past 20 years or so. And what you see here is a sort of heat map. And in this case, white is no data, and light blue it's a number that is 10 to, hold on one second. The white is less than 10%, and the darker blue is 10 to 15%. So I'm going to show you what happens to our country over the past few years. And as you go to 1986, you see a little more blue. 1987, 88, 89, 1990. And you begin to see a trend, especially in the South, of much more obesity. And in this case, obesity is arbitrarily defined as a body mass index of greater than 30, which means about 30 pounds overweight for a person who's 5'4". So this is 1992. Let's keep going. There's 93 and 94 and 95 and 96 and 97 and 98, 1999 and 2000. And the trend has only gotten worse. So now there's 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. Really pretty amazing what's happened to our country. And our bodies are changing radically as a result of something. Something is going on. And we're seeing an epidemic of obesity that never existed before in the history of our species. It's pretty remarkable. And so I want to then go back and talk about, it's not just obesity, interestingly. It's actually also diabetes. So this graph simply describes obesity on the top, going back early on in 1994, and there's the rates of diabetes. And this is overall defined by the CDC, includes type 1 plus type 2, but most diabetes is type 2. And you see that the trends are parallel. So the increased rates of obesity are parallel by increased rates of type 2 diabetes, so that by 2013, you see much more obesity and much more type 2 diabetes. And it's a really shocking thing that's happened, and it puts us at great risk for disease. As exemplified by the late, great B.B. King, one of many people who live with type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is the most common form of diabetes. It's growing in prevalence, as I've shown you. It's all ethnic groups, and treated pills for some, but injected insulin quite often, and a major risk of life-threatening complications, even when treated well. So a big, big problem. So I think the big question I've been asking is, why are we gaining weight? What's going on? Why are we changing as a society? Well, if you Google this question, why are we gaining weight? One of the websites that you will come across is this one, which describes this hypothesis of energy balance. And the idea goes, essentially, understanding energy balance is the key to maintaining a healthy weight and fitting all foods and beverages into an active, healthy lifestyle that includes a sensible diet based on balance, variety, and moderation, and regular physical activity. So that's a hypothesis that has been very popular in our society. And the argument goes, if we just knew how to maintain this balance, we would be okay. And one big proponent of this has been Steve Blair. And he says, maybe the reason people are getting more calories than they need is they are not burning many. So this hypothesis of the energy balance has been very strong, and it's had really elite proponents, and it remains essentially the dogma in our field. The crux of the idea, again, is that there's a balance in between calories in and calories out, and diet in and activity out. And if you have a relative imbalance and not enough activity, you're going to gain weight. Okay, so this, again, is a very dominant idea. It's throughout the lay press, and it's been promoted by some very powerful organizations, including this one, which is the Beverage Institute, which is wholly funded by Coca-Cola. And they are attempting to make the case that it's really an equation of in versus out. And if you merely knew what to do and you were more active, you'd be able to lose weight. And I think that notion has been really has been transmitted quite strongly in the popular press. So one interesting question then goes, can lifestyle intervention reduce obesity and prevent type 2 diabetes? And the most famous paper to study this was in the New England Journal of Medicine, published back in 2002. And they did something pretty amazing. So they took adults who were about to get type 2 diabetes, who were so-called pre-diabetic, and they had them exercise 1 hour per day. And so they gave them in really intense classes on nutrition as well as exercise. They got them in these group activities, and they were able to sustainably get somebody to exercise an hour a day, which is really difficult. I can't exercise an hour a day. I do too much travel. And they were able to lose weight quite a bit, 15 pounds initially, but you'll also notice that they gained it back over time. Not all of it, but some of it. And they had a 40% reduction in the incidence of type 2 diabetes. So that's exciting, and it suggests that lifestyle intervention could make a big difference to reduce type 2 diabetes. And if we only knew what they did and we did what they did, we would be okay, and our society would have far less type 2 diabetes. So I know many of you probably heard of this paper, at least through the lay press. It was exceptionally popular, very influential. Enough time has passed that we now have the long-term follow-up, and that has been published here. So the long-term follow-up is decidedly more mixed. So this is a 15-year follow-up from the start of the study, and we've been able to follow this cohort and see what happens to them over time. And as you see, the curves of diabetes, and again, the green is the lifestyle intervention, the curves got tighter together. You'll also notice that all of the people had increased risk over time, and that whatever impact this lifestyle intervention of eating less and doing more exercise was incredibly modest. So that's concerning, because I think that we often like to think that a simple intervention of eating a little bit better and exercising more could have a dramatic difference in our rates of type 2 diabetes. But I think what we're, at this point, you're slicing the salami very thin. The overall impact for this population is very modest. And then the question goes, why is that? Well, excuse me, if you look at the weight loss for the group and you follow it over time, you see that the weight curves eventually get very close together. And it shows you that it's incredibly difficult to sustainably lose weight. And remember, this group that got this lifestyle intervention received an incredible intervention. Essentially, nothing was spared. They had classes, they had counseling, they worked out together, and despite all of that, they weren't able to sustainably lose weight. So that's humbling, because it says that if, as a society, 4 years of classes and teaching somebody how to do something didn't work, we simply don't have the resources as a society to ultimately reduce this through whatever was done here. Again, advice around diet plus exercise. That's a problem. So I think another question then goes, why is it so hard to lose weight? And what are we eating? And why do we eat the foods we do? And you all know this picture from the food pyramid. This came from the early 90s, and it's actually derivative of a food pyramid that was originally published by a Swedish food scientist back in the 70s. And the carbohydrates are the base, they're on the bottom. And then fruit is up higher, and then beyond that is meat and things like milk and dairy. And at the very top is fats, oils, and sweets. And this has been claimed to be the optimal diet for at least the past few decades. But if you go and you ask the experts in the field, and by the way, I'm not one. I'm really just, I'm a scientist with an interest in this field. It's really not my major area of expertise. Everybody refers you to this report called the DRI. And this is published by the Institute of Medicine. It's the most influential nutrition report that's come out in many, many years. It's available free. You can read it. It's 400 pages. I actually did, over Christmas, my wife can attest to this. And it tells you essentially what you're supposed to eat. And what they say is that if you have too much of any one thing, you get in trouble. So if the scale is tilted towards more carbs, they say you're gonna have far less HDL, and that's the good cholesterol, and you're gonna have more triglycerides and more LDL, and that's the bad cholesterol, and ultimately you're gonna have more cardiovascular risk. So they say, well, don't eat too many carbs. But then they also say, if you eat too much fat, you're gonna have more dietary energy, and you're gonna gain weight. And they say you'll have more saturated fat, and you'll have more cardiovascular risk. That's the argument that they make in essentially the most influential document that's been shaping our nutrition guidelines in the United States. And they say on the basis of this balance and this problem, you got to pick a healthy mix. And what they pick is a fat that, so they say carbs in between 45 and 65%, and fat between 25 and 35. And that has radically shaped the nutrition advice that we receive. But if you begin to ask the question, what kind of diet should we be eating? And you look at the most rigorous data, you begin to see that it's far more complex than this. So this is a study that was done in the New England Journal, and it included some of the most influential people who study nutrition. This is Frank Hu and Walter Willett from the Harvard School of Public Health. It's an exceptional paper, and it uses the Nurses' Health Study, which is this incredibly powerful study on nutrition and health outcomes. And what it shows is that the people who ate the most refined carbs had the most weight gain, and really strong statistical associations. So that goes against the food pyramid, and it suggests that there's something unique about macronutrient content that might influence weight gain. Well, there's been other studies around the so-called Mediterranean diet, and there are ways to score a diet for how Mediterranean they are, and it's sort of how much fiber and how much vegetables and how much vegetable fat and things like nuts. And so they come up with a score for this. This is published in the New England Journal again back in 2003. And what they showed is that the more Mediterranean diet, the least death. And that's pretty surprising, very powerful associations. Well, I want to take you through a little bit of physiology around this idea and begin to talk about this hypothesis of carbs versus fat as macronutrients. And I'm sorry to drag you through this slide, but essentially what I want to talk about is that insulin ultimately works on skeletal muscle, and it promotes glucose uptake into skeletal muscle. And insulin also acts on the liver, and it tells the liver to shut down the production of glucose. And then insulin has another role in fat, and it tells glucose to go into fat. And it also promotes the uptake of these fatty acids into the fat, ultimately promoting fat growth. And so if you have insufficient insulin, you essentially, all of these systems go awry. If you don't make enough insulin, you can't drive your glucose into muscle, and the glucose goes up. You also can't suppress the liver's production of glucose, and you have more glucose in the blood. And then you also have many more fatty acids, and in the fat, you don't drive glucose into the fat. So this is a sort of classic description of diabetes and the physiology of diabetes. But what I want to tell you is that insulin is fertilizer for fat cells. And what happens is there's this enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. And insulin promotes action of lipoprotein lipase, and it converts fatty acids into triglycerides, and that's how the fat cells grow and expand. Insulin also suppresses this stuff called hormone-sensitive lipase, and basically that shuts down the outflow into the fat cell, and the sum total is more insulin, bigger fat cells. This idea of insulin as fertilizer for fat cells has been popularized by people including David Ludwig, who's a brilliant pediatric endocrinologist at Harvard, and it's been known for many, many years. Most famously around type 1 diabetes. So this is a picture around the time of the discovery of insulin, and the child that you see here had absolute decompensated new onset type 1 diabetes, and this is a picture of the same child after administration of insulin, and this boy was one of the first children to be treated with insulin. So you see the dramatic impact that insulin has on body fat, really showing that it has this, again, this amazing activity on fat cells. So if we have this idea that insulin is fertilizer for fat cells, then the question goes, what happens when you add something like Snackwell's cookies? Well, they're converted to carbs. They're basically pure carbs. They're converted to sugar. And what happens is you have much more sugar around and ultimately much stronger signals of insulin to promote glucose uptake into skeletal muscle. You also end up with very strong signals in the liver and very strong signals in the fat. And the problem with the strong signals in the fat is they ultimately promote fat growth. So the idea is a very simple one, which is more dietary carbs, more potential exposure to this growth-promoting effect of insulin on fat. And so the idea behind this vision of low-carb, high-fat is very simple. If the macronutrients that you eat are primarily fat with a little bit of protein and carbohydrates that are vegetables, and therefore not that carb-rich, what happens is you have less of this signal ultimately going to your skeletal muscle. You require less production by the beta cell. You end up with far less insulin required in the body, and these signals are quite weak, and ultimately the body's exposed to less insulin, and in the end, the amount of insulin that reaches the fat is less, and ultimately the adipocyte, the fat cell, shrinks. So could that be true? Well, certainly we know it's true in type 1 diabetes, and there's some evidence, at least from epidemiology, that this might be true, and I can show you some of this. One really complicated piece of this, though, is this concern around saturated fat and health. And I think that if people look at a diet like this and they say, okay, well, Kushner said to eat Crisco, I would say no. Please don't. And as you'll see, there are real differences in between one fat and another, and it's important to be smart about it. So do saturated fats influence human health? There's been some terrific meta-analyses of this question, and they show that saturated fat overall is not associated with increased death in patients who are at risk for cardiovascular death. It appears to be neutral, and that's surprising. And again, this is a so-called meta-analysis that combines a bazillion studies and many, many patients. So saturated fat appears to be neutral, at least for this population. That may not be every population. But how about trans fats? You've all heard about trans fats. Trans fats are really quite complicated. Trans fats do increase the risk of cardiovascular death. And trans fats, the problem with trans fats is there's really two different kinds. There's that which we get from the factory, and there's that which you get from animal fat. So the industrial trans fats, such as Crisco, they increase risk of cardiovascular death, no question. And that's been reliably demonstrated for many years. And that's part of why trans fats are going to be removed from the food stream fairly soon by virtue of the US government. But the animal trans fats do not reliably influence cardiovascular death. It's kind of surprising. And moreover, animal trans fats reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes very strongly. And I don't quite understand this, except that maybe the people who are consuming more animal fat are consuming less carbs. And it's worth pointing out that you can't just say, okay, I'm not going to eat carbs, and then I'm going to keep all my other macronutrients the same. Our bodies have these very strong homeostatic mechanisms that will ultimately balance how many calories you get in or out. It's almost impossible to go on a crash diet for a long period of time. If you eat fewer calories, you're going to burn fewer calories, and you're going to ultimately simply stop moving because you have this sense of starvation. So I don't think you can necessarily cut out carbs without realizing that you're ultimately going to add fat and or protein. And fat is probably better than protein for the simple reason that it doesn't also get converted to carbs. And more protein ultimately does get converted to carbs, at least on a 0.6 ratio. So how about a really rigorous test of the Mediterranean diet? And this has been carried out recently. The gold standard for any epidemiologist is the so-called randomized control clinical trial, the RCT. And they did this. It's so cool. So this is a really rigorous, very expensive, complicated study that took people who were at risk for cardiovascular disease and randomized them to either control arm or they taught them how to cook the Mediterranean diet, and they gave them boxes of hazelnuts every month in the mail, or a third arm that taught them Mediterranean diet and gave extra virgin olive oil and exhorted them to consume more extra virgin olive oil. And so what you're seeing here is the primary outcome measure, which is their primary endpoint, which was acute myocardial infarction, which is heart attack, stroke, or death from cardiovascular disease. And you see this huge difference as a result of olive oil or nuts on these primary outcomes. Really statistically significant. And I think that's very exciting because it's not that expensive in comparison to the original trial that I showed you before, the diabetes prevention program. This is a little more reasonable for us to follow, frankly. A sub-analysis has been carried out recently about what was happening, and what it shows is that amongst those patients who consumed increased dietary fat, there was way less cardiovascular disease. And moreover, those who had increased dietary fat had less death. So it's a dose-dependent response. And when you break it down into so-called quintiles, so you break it down by fifths, the people in the group that consumed the most fat had the least cardiovascular death by a third. And moreover, the people who consumed the most fat had the least death by nearly half. Now, this is not the general population. This is an at-risk population, but it shows you the potential impact of diet on human health. It's really powerful. So how about type 2 diabetes? Because I kept telling you that obesity and type 2 diabetes are a major issue. They've done sub-analyses on type 2 diabetes, and even here, there are big differences in between olive oil and nuts and the rates of type 2 diabetes. They can't prevent it completely, but certainly the curves are different. And it suggests, again, that diet strongly influences human health. So, nuts? Seriously? Yes, seriously nuts. So here's another terrific article that was published in the New England Journal, which is from the Nurses' Health Study, that shows how consumption of nuts is associated with less death. And again, this is the Nurses' Health Study. It's a huge cohort. It's statistically powered way beyond what you would expect, and the associations are extremely strong. Association does not mean causality, but the randomized controlled clinical trial I showed you before strongly does imply causality. So we've been reading and thinking about this topic for a while. This is a terrific book that came out only a few years ago, and it's a simplified version of this one, Good Calories, Bad Calories. And again, these two books, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, and this other book, which is called Good Calories, Bad Calories, written by this author and physicist named Gary Taubes. So he's a science writer who's written quite a bit. The second book is extremely dense, but it was very fun for me to read, and I read it over several months and was raving like a lunatic when I read some of the passages. I was just so blown away by the information contained within it. The first book is really a different book. It tells you a sort of overall philosophical approach about what to eat, and then it also talks about some practical tips to what you should actually do. But neither of these books are original, and way back in the 70s, there was a guy named John Yudkin, who was in the United Kingdom, who was one of the most influential scientists studying nutrition, and he wrote this famous book called Pure, White, and Deadly, which is a description of the impact of sugar on human health. And this book has been largely forgotten, but I remember it on the bookshelves when I was growing up. My hippie mom bought it, and as a result, we had no refined sugar in my house growing up in the 70s. But the book has been rediscovered and is gaining popularity, as I'll show you. There's, of course, this other one, Dr. Atkins, and Atkins is incredibly controversial, and when people talk about the Atkins diet, they say, oh, you're talking about making somebody eat hamburgers but no bun, and all the saturated fat doesn't matter. And it's kind of an extremist position, and I think we have a much more nuanced view of this topic, especially now that the PREDIMED study has come out with olive oil, really clearly showing that olive oil can have beneficial effects. The U.S. dietary guidelines are published by the government every few years, and the latest version came out. The U.S. dietary guidelines make no mention of this hypothesis of low-carb, high-fat as a driver of human health. And it illustrates how incredibly controversial this topic is in our society. If you ask 10 experts, you get 10 different opinions. And the people who wrote the dietary guidelines were largely not those who have been driving this new innovative approach to nutrition. There have been some very strong rebukes of the dietary guidelines, including this one by Nina Teicholz. And she writes, this was in the British Medical Journal, and she simply asked the question, is the scientific report guiding the US dietary guidelines, and is it significant? So she's asking a good question with some very strong points. And this article in the British Medical Journal was ultimately responded by some of the senior-most people in the field. And so there was a letter requesting the British Medical Journal to retract the article I just showed you. And the letter was co-signed by 140 of the most famous nutrition scientists in America and around the world. So it shows you that there are these two camps, and they are diametrically opposed. And there's a lot at stake, and I think it's really a rich debate. So I don't stand before you saying that one camp is absolutely right and the other camp is absolutely wrong. But it's important to make your own conclusions, because frankly, there's no consensus. There's smart people on either side, and I think it will play itself out over the coming years. If you want to learn more about this topic, here's another book which is written by Anders Einsfeldt, and he's in Sweden and really terrific. And here's another one by one of the experts in the field, who's ultimately, so this guy is a nutritionist and scientist in South Africa. His name is Tim Noakes, and he's currently being investigated by the Association of Nutritionists for providing what they said to be fraudulent advice. And so they're trying to take away his license, his professional license in South Africa. So again, very controversial, really heated topic. Nina Teicholz has written this book called The Big Fat Surprise, which has been very popular, that also describes some of this. And then my friend David Ludwig, who's a pediatric endocrinologist like myself at Boston Children's, has written a new book called Always Hungry. And then finally, I would highly recommend this, which is written, it came out in The Guardian just a few weeks ago. It's called The Sugar Conspiracy. And it's quite long. There's a podcast that's about 45 minutes. It's excellent. And you can either listen to it or read it. It gives a really excellent overview of the topic and describes the sort of back and forth of this topic over time. Highly recommended. But again, I think that this is a moving target. It's going to change, and we'll learn much more. So that's really all I had. I didn't want to try to summarize the book that you have before you. I wanted to give you a chance to read it for your own. It's a great book. I've spent the past few weeks reading it myself. It essentially describes some of the arguments that I've given to you today. I think Gary Taubes has been criticized as being not quite balanced enough by some of the people who disagree with him. He's a very smart person and ultimately has been able to sway quite a few people to think more critically about this subject, including the Arnold Family Foundation, who have funded the so-called NUSI, which is the Nutritional Science Initiative. So it's a Houston connection, and they're carrying out a really terrific randomized controlled clinical trial of the low-carb, high-fat hypothesis around the world with some of the best scientists imaginable. So with that, I'd just like to make some acknowledgments of the folks who have helped me along the way, including clinicians as well as my research funding sources. I've had some terrific conversations with people who live with type 1 diabetes who are thinking about nutrition. And then I'd also like to thank the folks from Texas Children's Office of Development for putting this event on, including Kelly Clyburn, who's here in the back, Laura Schuford and Amber Tabora, and Jessica Turnasek. And then special thanks to all of you, to the ambassadors at Texas Children's Hospital. The work that you do on behalf of our organization is incredibly important. The advocacy is a really big deal. We are a big organization, but we're fragile. the community support makes a big difference. Ultimately, we want to grow. There's a lot of unmet need in the world. This is a special place. It's a unique resource for people who live here in Houston and for those around the world. And it's a partnership in between the hospital and the community. It's your hospital. So thank you all for coming today. So this is a good question. The question is, does the advice depend upon age? You know, if I give you the U.S. dietary guidelines advice, it would be a different answer. But I imagine that what children are consuming will probably mirror what adults consume. And the big question boils down to the juice boxes and the goldfish and the sweet pops. I know very few children who are deprived by eating healthy food. And actually, you know, there's been don't get me started, but I think the whole kid food thing is terrible. The pizza, macaroni and cheese, chicken nuggets, right? Grilled cheese, these sort of yellow colored foods. And if you can possibly feed your children what you eat, I think they will ultimately learn. But the other piece is having your children help you to participate in food preparation and learn about food and be active participants. Food doesn't come from a paper bag. Yeah.
Different diet groups. And I was wondering if they factored in other outside positive incentives, carrots, if you will, to keep people on track.
Oh, yeah.
Money. or those sorts of
This is, oh, you're talking about, so it's this study, right? Yeah. So this was carried out by the NIH, and it included the best and the brightest who participated. The people who carried out this study were not dummies. They collected information from around the world, trying to come up with best practices. So I would argue that it's not for lack of effort. And what we know in general is that if you put more pressure on somebody to lose weight, just from sheer will, and you feed them less food, what happens is they stop burning energy. And so this is really complicated, but one of the subjects in the book is around this question of, can you really lose weight simply by changing your caloric intake? And the answer is a surprising no. It's probably more that the energy that you consume influences the energy that you feel and the energy that you use for your daily activities. And if you cut that back, you simply stop moving as much and stop burning as much energy. And so this has been known for some time. There's very strong compensation. Is there a question there? Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. Metformin is very interesting, and there's been a lot of talk about it. And there are some people who are taking it as an anti-aging study, or as an anti-aging therapy. I think it's going to be relatively weak. I don't imagine that if you take a pill, you'll be able to live an extra 2 or 3 decades. But that experiment has been carried out in mice, and the mice do live longer. But we're not laboratory rodents. Metformin is a pretty strong drug, and it does have some side effects, including GI side effects. So But there's a lot of talk about it, and I think it's an outstanding question. It's not an easy drug to take. We have patients with type 2 diabetes who take it, and some of them do okay, and some of them not so great. Question back, either one?
Just had a question about what we put on children
Yeah.
at a young age. What's your opinion on sugar causing diabetes?
This is a great question. So, well, the question is, what is the contribution of nutrition to the incidence of diabetes? We don't believe that there's any relationship in between dietary nutrition and type 1 diabetes. Or if there is a relationship, it's very, very weak. But there's certainly a lot of influence in between dietary nutrition and the incidence of obesity and subsequent development of type 2 diabetes. And we know in general that children who consume more sweetened drinks have much higher rates of obesity. And we also, I don't know if you saw this article that came in the New England Journal this week or last week, it showed that childhood obesity is strongly associated with adult cardiovascular death. So they followed the cohorts for 40 years, and they saw really big associations in between chubby kids and kids who have higher rates of heart attack or stroke as adults. That's really scary. There's a question in the back.
So I love that heat map progression.
Yeah.
If we look at regions around the world, are there other regions that are good benchmarks that turn into Mediterranean?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what are the global trends for obesity? Well, we are exporting everything, including our diet. But you certainly can see regional differences. In some places where they consume more of a Mediterranean diet have had far lower rates of obesity. And France in particular has always had much higher rates of saturated fat, and they've been thinner. That's been largely ascribed to, Gitane and Gauloise, these cigarettes. But even when you control for cigarette consumption, they're still thinner than, for instance, the Germans. So there's a real issue here. Yeah. This is a great question. What is the relationship in between sleep and rates of obesity and or diabetes? And the answer is it's very powerful. So people who are sleep deprived tend to have higher insulin levels. And if you think back to that cartoon that I showed you, they might actually end up growing more fat as a result. So a lot of people are talking about the need to get a good night's sleep because it ultimately, otherwise, might increase your circulating insulin values. That's a real issue. And it becomes even more of a difficult issue if you've gained so much weight that you now have sleep apnea, and therefore you're chronically sleep deprived, because then your insulin values will be even higher. It's hard. We live in a society where a lot is expected of us, and many people work a lot, and they also stay on electronic devices late into the night. And I think the sum total of that is, for many folks, sleep deprived. Certainly my teenage daughters, when they were in school, were sleeping far less than they should. And we knew that because they would sleep in on the weekends to catch up. Question back. About chromium, yeah. I'm really not an expert in it. If chromium has an effect, it's pretty modest. It'll be relatively weak compared to all the other things we've done. I think there's been a few studies here and there showing some slight differences, but nothing like this stuff. But you never say never. Medicine remains, as they say, the youngest science. We're still learning. Yes. Yes. Okay, so the question goes this. So now we're getting down to brass tacks. This is a great question. So the question is full-fat milk versus skim milk. So what is skim milk? Skim milk is white Coke. White Coke. Coca-Cola. Okay? It's sugar water. It's lactose and a little bit of protein that makes it cloudy. You've stripped away all the fat. And there's a beautiful study that came out recently that showed that it's pretty amazing. It showed that the more dairy fat people are consuming, the lower the risk of type 2 diabetes. So all of a sudden, our universe just got thrown upside down. And I don't really know, except that it fits with this overarching hypothesis that more dietary fat may be beneficial. But I always am a little bit cautious. Again, the way I think of skim milk is it's Snackwell's cookies, right? It's a pure carb meal. And if you had to choose in between Snackwell's cookies and some other thing, I would say pick a more balanced diet or pick something that has more fat in it. There's a question over here. Yes, yeah. There are differences in nuts. That's a good point. So peanuts have a lot of protein in them, and protein gets converted to carbohydrates on a 0.6 ratio. For every gram of protein, you end up with 0.6 grams of carbohydrates. So if you're eating protein unnecessarily, and we don't need that much, you're going to ultimately get carbs cryptically. And so there are some nuts that are a little bit better than others. The ones that they say are the best are the macadamia nuts, which are 90% fat. But I don't think it's like an absolute thing. And ultimately, each of these are way better than eating Snackwell's cookies. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a really important point. When we consume high-carb meals, so the question is, what's the relation between insulin and appetite in obesity? When we consume high-carb meals, what often happens is we overshoot, and we end up with slightly low blood sugars 3 or 4 hours after the meal. And you know that feeling after a big carb meal when you're hungry and a little bit irritable, and you start to eat more. And that has been said to contribute to the epidemic of obesity, because at that point, you're very strongly motivated to consume more carbs. It's also known that insulin has a role in the brain to control areas that influence appetite. And so the thought is there could be glucose sensors in the body that are transmitting to the brain, and that the exposure to a lot of carbohydrates could be influencing the amount of insulin in these key areas of the hypothalamus that determine appetite and energy homeostasis. And actually, the lab that I trained in as a scientist many years ago did some pioneering work in this area. Right. That's right. Good question. What's the relation between vitamins and macronutrients? I think it's more, I don't see a direct connection, but if you're consuming foods that aren't colorful, in all likelihood you're not getting many of the micronutrients that you need. But interestingly, the vitamin supplements haven't really been held out as a major determinant of human health. If the stuff on your plate is colorful and has a variety of different things, you probably don't need a vitamin supplement. Yeah, the fat, not that much relationship in between fat and vitamins. Yeah, so there's a very strong genetic predisposition towards weight gain, and some people will definitely gain weight easier than others. There's no question that there's huge differences in our population. But we can't change our genes. And there are even people who are thin who have increased risk of cardiovascular disease based on the kind of diet that they're consuming. So regardless of whether, I think it's really about these overarching questions of fitness and cardiovascular health. Yeah, but you can't change our genes, and moreover, all the drugs that have been tried out to date as interventions for obesity have really failed. They've been overwhelming disappointments. And You know, the most famous one was something that looked like the opposite of marijuana, and not surprisingly, people were incredibly unhappy. And they had increased rates of suicide, and they pulled the drug. So the problem is appetite and energy homeostasis is central to consciousness, and I think it's a fantasy to imagine that there will be a safe pill that will be able to reliably change it. It's just too central to what our bodies do. Yeah, so cholesterol is very complicated, and if you ask people, you'll hear many different things. This book would suggest that cholesterol has no influence on heart health. I think it's probably much more nuanced than that. And again, there's many different kinds of cholesterol. There's good cholesterols and bad cholesterols. And even, it's not just how much LDL you have, it's the LDL particle number. It's really overwhelming for me as a scientist. I can't imagine how difficult it would be for somebody in the lay community. The messages are very mixed. One important question you should be asking is, well, if I eat more cholesterol, will my serum cholesterol go up? And the answer for that one is, it depends. And there are some people for whom eating more cholesterol in the diet, like eggs, has a very strong effect on their serum cholesterol. And there's also people who will consume more saturated fat and their cholesterol will rise dramatically. So it makes sense if you play around with this to get your cholesterol checked at baseline to then figure out if this diet has an impact on your cholesterol and is potentially putting you at risk. And that's what we're telling our patients. Good, so good question. What about the relationship between low-carb, high-fat diet and cancers? Well, the opposite has been studied intensely. So we know that consumption of carbohydrates put people at risk for obesity, and they are at increased risk for certain kinds of cancers. And so the thought is that by essentially insulin is a fertilizer for fat cells and may also be a growth factor for certain kinds of cancers, such as prostate cancer and breast cancer. So I think the intriguing question goes, could you alter that risk by consuming non-carb containing meals to therefore lower your lifetime exposure to insulin? So it's a really complicated topic. As you can tell, I'm spending a lot of time reading about it. I'm not at all satisfied with my state of knowledge on this. I'm reading a lot and trying to understand a lot. We'd be happy to share a document that describes some of these references for those of you who want to read more. Please email Kelly or the ambassadors. And again, we'll put together a document that includes many of these references. And this is a work in progress. I'd like to get your feedback about this talk and about any other questions you have.